Rand Institute, the Brookings Institute. All of these orgs are royal. They're offshoots of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Mount Perelin Society and so on and so forth, or the Club of the Isles and all of these alpha lodges of Freemasonry. And they've been slowly moving into the American milieu. They carry the symbolism that's almost identical to that which is used by the oligarchs of England. And they did that through your American Constitution and through the Founding Fathers, who are nothing less than British agents for the most part.
Most of the Founding Fathers were Freemasons, correct?
Yeah.
Almost all of them. And people have to realize that when they say that, they've got to understand that saying Freemason doesn't really tell you that much. Some of these people were not only Freemasons, but very high degree Freemasons. That's the point. Mm-hmm. They were not just your common, like your dad or my dad going down to the lodge, that kind of thing, having a few drinks and all that.
It's a whole different world.
Yes, it's a totally different world. So always have to add that point that, number one, I'm not indicting normal Freemasons in any sense, nor am I indicating that these people are of your normal traditional Freemasonic type, that the local pub owner or the local governor, or even to that extent police chief or whatever. It's far, far higher than that. These people come from dynastic families: Livingstone, Menzies, oh my God, the list goes on of these families, the Sinclairs and the Kellogg's and whatever. There's so many families, the bloodline families, really.
See, I'm pretty vested in your work, and I had Dave watch Architects of Control just recently, and we also watched a little bit of Age of Manipulation, which is, I believe, a 9-hour series.
Something like that, yeah.
It's great, but considering that this information is kind of new to a large part of my audience, can you sort of broadly talk to us about the history of the control and some of the major lies we've been told, including our origins? And I also was always curious, is like, what is really the point outside of, I guess, control to hide that information from us? Because you could tell us a real history in some ways, and really just with an economic model still enslave us.
Well, slavery is what you are talking about is slavery. Right. But slavery is ultimately a model that doesn't work unless you have hierarchy. So when you start studying one thing, like say slavery, look at just my 9-to-5 job, how I'm locked in there, or I hate my boss, or look at who I am in this university, I've tried my best, but all these guys above me, whatever way the little man starts to already start asking questions that lead one thing to another. It's like I've always described it as pulling a little thread, then the thread becomes a string, the string becomes a rope, the rope becomes a chain, and the next thing you know, you got a big whale in your living room. Mm-hmm. So these things, one leads to the other, and then you start studying slavery, or debt slavery, or what have you, and then you start moving up to say, who are these corporations? And then you go beyond, and you start finding out about these secret societies that are all over the world, and these chivalric orders and their antiquity. And then somebody like me would say, oh, wait a minute. As you said from the beginning, the symbolism tells you, well, that's kind of crazy, because there's a lot of Egyptian symbolism. It's a lot of what appears to be Jewish symbolism. Oh, why is that? How does that work? One thing keeps leading to the other. And then you start finding out it goes deeper and deeper, all the way back through Babylon, the monetary system, back through Rome, the symbolism. All of this goes all the way back to Egypt. And you start tracking all of this. And the moment that you're getting wiser and wiser, and the moment you're getting smarter and smarter on this, or let's just use the symbolism I use a lot of the mountain, you're getting higher and higher. There's a dark side. And that is you're getting further and further away from the people that you grew up with.
Right.
Intellectually. Right? So just as you're about to turn around and go, hey, guys, here, I can give you a handle on what's going on here. And this can be in even a quite small way. Nobody wants to hear. So then that apathy starts taking you yet in another direction. And what I mean by that, of course, is then you're into the study of psychology. Because now you have to say that there's a relationship between the slave and the master. It's not just a straight situation of control. I'm speaking like this because you jogged my memory about the Architects of Control DVD, where we went into this more than at other times, in which we started to try and point out that this is a slave-master relationship. And that can't be understood at all until you understand what it is in the mind of the slave that wants to have the master, wants to obey authority. This takes you into then a lot of what to me is more fascinating information, because as you well know, most of the people in the conspiracy folk or the people who are into revisionism will put the focus mostly on that overt control. And they're implying by that the slave actually would love to be free. See, I've never believed this. I actually believe that it's a relationship, just in the same way that you can hear them say it. I mean, you listen to Aldous Huxley and people like that, they'd be glad to tell you this. Right. That man has been a slave, and he's an instrument in his own enslavement. What has happened down through the centuries is that the slave has just exchanged chains of iron for chains of gold, metaphorically speaking. You know, if he can have a bit less punitive treatment, he'll be okay with that. He doesn't really want to leave the walls of the prison.
Right.
So a person like me is standing there saying, but the gates can be opened, wide open, and you can all leave. And they're all sitting there going, no, you leave. We're happy here. So then what happens is this road then takes you into a study of psychology and the dynamics of consciousness and what have you. And then you start putting your finger on the very nexus of it, the very nub of this whole problem that you then see played out in society or played out in politics, whereas that it's a relationship between the slave and the master, and you understand then the brilliance of the controller, the big brother, so to speak, as that term has been used, because they're aware of this. As you start getting really clever with this, because you realize that the slave doesn't want to really be free, and that if he gives up one set of chains, he just buys into another one. Then you start to understand that it's the slave master who has understood this. This is part of the occult knowledge that they use. So one angle of this could take you into studying ancient history as a historian, but another direction can take you into studying philosophy or say even psychology, and keep it contemporary, contemporary to what's happening now. Yeah, now, I mean, obviously you need to do both as much as possible, but for me the more intriguing aspect is the psychology, because then you're kind of understanding, you're seeing through their eyes, you're seeing through the eyes of the master. If the master can create a situation in which his slave is auto-hypnotized, my God, then the game is up, because the slave is doing his own hypnotizing. He's completely on remote control, as we spoke about in the DVD. And then when you now going to move on to talk about remedies to these problems, a person like myself who's made a study of this is no longer really convinced that political change is really going to work. We don't rule it out, but we are certainly not as optimistic about that kind of change. We understand now that the change has to take on an individual psychological level. That's where the Gordian knot is. As I said, a lot of this master-slave relationship stuff can be found even on a day-to-day basis in the place of work or even in the home, certainly in the relationship of parents to children and teachers and society to the young and all the rest of it, and then ultimately internally, the relationship that we have with our own selves internally. So, and what I mean by that is that, see, it's a strange quirk of human nature that as soon as you're born, you have two enemies, so to speak, two adversaries. One is the outer world of all of its quandaries and tribulations and stimuli. You have to defend against that. You've got to negotiate all of that, all the ups and downs and shenanigans of the external world in order to stay sane and to be able to function. But we're also, as human beings, have this internal world, what apparently is the subjective world, to deal with, our own complexes, our own syndromes. So human beings stand on the sort of twilight zone between an external world that's threatening and impenetrable, so to speak, and you have this internal world. And the masters at the top of the ladder know all about this. And one of the methodologies that then they use to keep people in a state of total lockdown is this trauma and the constant fear and the constant anxiety, knowing full well that if you create a lot of external tribulation of whatever kind it may be, hidden and more obvious, that will have a psychological consequence in which the person themselves is just literally drowning, in anxiety. And it's through this fear equals anxiety dynamic that the greatest control operates, really.
Yeah, when you mention the trauma, it makes me think about, I've seen in your work and other work as well from Jordan Maxwell or David Icke. A lot of this is ancient trauma that comes from the origins of our species, which is, it's interesting that all ancient texts talk about gods coming from the sky, and to me, I can completely see that being extraterrestrials and not gods. There's, in translation, that would be hard to differentiate between the two. And,
it is.
Also, it's interesting that we're the only being I know of that has two chromosomes fused into one slot, and I don't see that anywhere in nature.
Exactly. There's so many bizarrities about the human being. I've written about these in the Atlantis book, gone into great detail on this.
Hmm.
And again, I would say that even if you just start from a non-conspiratorial point of view, which means if you can't buy into the idea of alien invasion or whatever, just the very fact of earth changes, just the very fact of cataclysm in a physical sense. There are many authors who've written about this who haven't the faintest idea about conspiracy, and yet they still conclude that the mind was traumatized. One of those people is Julian Jaynes, um, the great scientist. So, and he's not the only one. So there's people from within the traditional world who have accepted that psychologically man suffered a major trauma. There's actually a whole school of these people. I refer to them in my DVD and book. Their names are right there for people to follow that up, who have actually concluded that man is a traumatized being. They all have sort of different takes on what caused the trauma, but they somewhat agree that some sort of earth changes, whether it was desertification, lack of rain, or it might have been volcanoes, or it might have been, the biblical flood. Some of them even do believe in that through the work of Immanuel Velikovsky and others, and Commons Beaumont and others, they do recognize that the world was, rent by enormous disasters. So even if you don't buy into an extraterrestrial presence, it still is factual enough to say that the earth itself, through plague, through famine, through cataclysm, through tidal waves and tsunamis and even a pole shift, all of this is now coming to light in very recent times. That alone will convince an open-minded person that something enormous took place to the psyche of man. In my opinion, there's no doubt about it. There can't be any doubt about it. And it is good to see that now David, for one, has been talking about that. His latest work is looking into the cataclysm somewhat.
Hmm.
And that's great because I insist that it needs to be studied. It's the center of my work. And it's very important to understand that particular original biological, physiological, and both psychological trauma aided and abetted the masters later on. They know about it. They know that the psyche is fragmented. They probably know a great deal about it. And they have said, well, listen, that happened fortunately. So all we got to do is sort of maintain a constant culture of trauma in order to bring in whatever agenda they're doing. They bring it in on the back of that, of wars, of famines, of poverty, of tremendous social injustice, and then the psychological versions of disorders that are rampant all over the world. If the mind is already schizoid in its very origin, if what we have as today's consciousness is schizoid in its origin, then it's very simple to create yet further forms of, schizophrenia in human beings. And then since human beings, through their life force, through their energy, create the societies that go on to then create the sociological setting, obviously those societies will then be schizogenic. And then it becomes a feedback loop. The schizogenic societies create yet further children who are polarized, fragmented, narrow, spiritless, whatever you want to call it, and then they go on to create yet more. So that's why we're heading towards this post-human world. That's a long time in the making. And it doesn't happen just through one thread. It's very deeply disturbed people, to the point where now they're even wanting to shut down emotion. People are not in any way attuned to their own emotions, for goodness sake. And then that brings up a huge big pharma leviathan to take care of that again, because what man will do and what man has been traditionally doing, and one thing we must insist is that you're going to see more of this as we count down to 2012 and beyond. What I'm going to say now is going to be increasing as the years go by, but it has been happening in the past all down through the ages, is that when a human being has that inner anxiety I was talking about, where they have to confront all the inner syndromes and complexes, one of the methodologies that the ego uses to offset responsibility or to just escape that inner trauma is to project it outwards, is to simply say that the reason for all their disorderly feelings or this feeling of anxiety or stress or whatever it might be, it's externally, it's because of this and that and the other. It's because of the economy. It's because of the wars. It's because of, relationships or whatever. Man will always find ways to project his inner angst onto the external world, place the blame there, and then step back, and then again want some authority figure to come in and lead them or guide them or fix it. So we have this problem as well, is what's called the transference, the displacement, or the sublimation. And people not taking personal responsibility for their consciousness or their lives, and then happily, in some sense of the word, projecting it outwards, and then either going to some high priest in the sense of even religion, or the high priests of psychology or psychiatry.